Hello and welcome. What we're going to be looking at in today's lessons, we're going to be looking at Reconstruction in the South. So our goals today are, students will be able to review the causes and consequences of the Civil War, assess the influence of significant people or groups on Reconstruction, analyze the sharecropping system and debt peonage, analyze support and resistance to the civil rights for minorities. The terms we need to know for today's lesson are scalawag, carpetbagger, segregation, integration, sharecropping, share tenancy, tenant farming, KKK, and the Enforcement Acts. So we look at a lot of the changes that took place in the South during Reconstruction. By 1870, all former Confederate states had met the requirements set forth by the Radical Republicans and had rejoined the Union. And when we go back to the requirements that existed, you had to pass the 13th Amendment, you had to support the 14th Amendment, you had to set up a constitution that outlawed slavery. And by 1870, they managed to do all of these things. Many blacks had begun to find success in these newly freed states. Millions of blacks now had the right to vote, and many blacks were serving as school superintendents, sheriffs, mayors, coroners, police chiefs, and representatives in state legislatures. Now, one of the things that we have to realize, though, with the election of these individuals is that a large number of whites in the South still can't vote. And they can't vote because they haven't taken an oath of loyalty back to the Union, so they're ineligible to vote. And a lot of whites are ineligible, or who are eligible to vote, refuse to do so as a means of protest against the government. So a lot of these offices are won largely because white citizens aren't voting within these societies. And really later on, when these individuals actually get the right to vote back or choose to exercise that right to vote, a lot of these offices that had been won by African Americans very quickly disappear. The South also dealt with a lot of other cultural changes. One of the types of individuals that they had to deal with were people known as scalawags. These were people who supported black rights, were Southerners who had largely been ignored in pre-war life, and they fought to make the freedmen's life better in the South. And this is something that, as you look at this, people who were largely marginalized that are now really going to have a huge part in reshaping the way that the South works with things. And they're much more vocal, and they have a much more active role in what's going on within the government. The South also dealt with what were known as carpetbaggers. These were people who carried their worldly possessions literally in bags made of cloth, made of carpet. And what they did is they came to the South to buy the land up cheap in order to seek their fortunes. So they wanted to buy the land cheap, they wanted to set up their own farms and plantations, and they really wanted to take advantage of the really negative things that had happened in the South. And that made a lot of Southerners, or most Southerners, really hate these carpetbaggers. They really resented the things that they represented because they looked at that as an attack on their way of life. So what were some of the failures of Reconstruction? While the Radical Republicans had sought equality for African Americans, they had not sought the same protections for women. Even the Radical Republicans felt that trying to deal with racial equality and trying to deal with gender equality was just something that was not feasible to do all at the same time. And it really puts a strain on a lot of relationships, and it's really unfortunate because this is a time where we're already dealing with a great deal of change, and women at this point in time are really looked at as being property. So to try and change the society that quickly would have definitely been a challenge, but it's definitely a missed opportunity that when you've already got all of this change going on, to try and add that little bit on there where you're providing voting rights to women is something that would have not been all that huge of a step at this point. The South was able to establish schools for blacks. These schools were, however, segregated from the rest of the white population. So we're going from the 1870s, where we've got segregated schools, to where they are supposed to legally be changed in 1954 with the court case of Brown versus Board of Education, which is something that we'll talk about later on in the year, to where institutional segregation still doesn't officially end, even though it legally ends in 1954. You still have a lot of schools that are segregated into the 1970s. And even in today's society, you look at the fact that in 2013, a school in Georgia held their first racially integrated prom, and you've got other schools that still have racially segregated proms even today. That even though we've got these rules and laws and things like that that were put into place, we've still managed to make these changes at a very, very slow pace, which is not something that you would normally expect. You would think after 100 years, or these concepts, that these types of issues would be resolved. They're still very much ingrained within a lot of American society. Even with the establishment of schools in the South, most Southerners remained illiterate, both black and white. The South also lagged behind the North in the quality of health care. In infrastructure, we've got to remember that the infrastructure is largely destroyed because of Sherman's march to the sea and the total warfare that existed within the South. They lag behind in housing, once again because of total war, and economic production. The South also dealt with extremely corrupt government officials who are taking bribes from those looking to take advantage of the Southern struggle. And they are coming into this society, and they're giving away lands, and they're giving away laws and things like that in order to make themselves personally rich. So what happens with a lot of these newly freed African Americans? Many newly freed blacks continued to work on the plantations that they had been slaves on. And even though slavery is now illegal, the concept of slavery doesn't die for another few decades. And the reason why this is because when these newly freed African Americans don't leave their plantations, they largely take on a role known as sharecropping. And in this concept of sharecropping, what would happen is the farmer would provide the plantation owner would provide these newly freed slaves seeds and tools in order to be able to work on the land. They would then grow the crops on the land and then take those to market and sell them. Now, the farmer would want to be repaid for the tools, the seeds, and interest. And a lot of times the interest rate was set at such a high rate, it would pretty much wipe out everything that that farmer had made. This means that they are now in debt to the plantation owner who had given them those things. So the next year when that farmer goes to farm again, he needs to borrow seed and he needs to borrow tools again, and he's going to pay that interest. And this is a way of keeping them in perpetual debt in order to ensure that they're going to continue to work on that land, which really is another system of slavery. Other newly freed individuals became tenant farmers, and this was something that was a lot rarer. Tenants paid cash to rent to a landowner, and then was free to choose and manage his own land and crop. But you had to have money to be able to establish that rent in the first place. And as we know, most newly freed slaves weren't making any money at all as slaves, and to be able to try and set up a system where you could pay rent on land was just not something that was feasible. Other newly freed individuals took to the cities, and they found work as carpenters, blacksmiths, cooks, or house servants. Unfortunately, many of these roles were very limited, and most blacks who went to the cities ended up either working in really poor working conditions or ended up living very much a homeless lifestyle within these cities and a very poor lifestyle. The Freedmen's Bureau greatly helped newly freed slaves in their post-slavery lives. And what they did is they established schools that helped blacks develop literacy skills. Black colleges are also created. We looked at the Morrill Act, we looked at the Land Grant Act, and one of the things that really comes along through these processes is that you get schools like FAMU, you get schools like BCC, other black universities throughout the United States, and this is where you really start to see these universities throughout the country take root. And then there are black churches. These black churches were created in many cities, and what these churches really focused on were trying to educate these newly freed slaves. They taught them how to read, they taught them how to write, they taught them skills for jobs. And these churches become gathering places for civil rights rallies. And it's a boon for African American culture. These churches are really hugely symbolic once you get into the 1950s and you see these civil rights movements and things like that are taking place. That this is the rallying point. This is where major leaders like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. come to speak. This is where a lot of the huge protests that existed were planned and later executed. As African Americans fight to try and gain equality within the United States, there are groups that arise whose sole purpose it is to try and get rid of those rights. One of the main organizations that is part of this is the KKK, or the Ku Klux Klan. And what Klan members do in order to be able to try and intimidate voters is that they burn homes, they burn schools, they burn churches, they burn crosses in people's front yards. They beat, they maim, they kill both blacks and those who supported black rights. So this is an organization that really tries to suppress the newly gained political rights of African Americans and is really trying to suppress the voice of those who support these types of rights. Now, Congress does try and step in order to be able to try and stop a lot of the actions of the KKK, and they passed something called the Enforcement Acts. And this made it a federal offense to interfere with the citizens' right to vote, because what the KKK would do is they would camp outside of polling places as a way of trying to intimidate black voters from actually showing up. This didn't stop the violence, though. And it took place in the community, it took place in the polling stations. You had to have people at the local level who were willing to actually enforce these laws, and that was something that really didn't take place.